Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing today. Radical Democrats have attempted all day to downplay, cover up, and ignore the reality that crisis pregnancy centers and churches are under attack. I guess their approach is not surprising. In my brief time in Congress, every single hearing that we have had, we hear the same narrative, that Republicans hearing today about blank is a fantasy, that it is a conspiracy theory. Well, 100 instances in the last couple years is not a fantasy. It is not a conspiracy theory. They have told us that the border is secure, of course. They have failed to acknowledge and indeed sneer at the weaponization of our federal government against its own citizens, despite most recently the Durham report that was dropped yesterday. They failed to condemn labeling parents as domestic terrorists for just speaking out at their school board meeting. The Democrats' own witness today, Ms. Camp, said that every administration has enforced the FACE Act, Republican and Democrat alike. The only caveat that I will say to that, the only asterisk that I would provide is, except this one. With over 100 attacks, threats, arson, spray painting, it is very clear that this administration has no intention of enforcing the laws unless it has a political benefit to them. You know, you look at, and the chairman talked about this earlier. Look at the dichotomy that we have here. On one hand, we have Mr. Houck, right? We have Eva Edel from Aiken, South Carolina, an 87-year-old lady who survived a communist concentration camp in Yugoslavia. She comes to America, and her egregious crime is singing hymns in a hallway. And over 2 years later, about 2 years later, she's charged with a federal crime with the full weight of the federal government. And we fast forward here to these instances that we outlined that are now in the record. Mother's Day last year, suspects reportedly threw 2 Molotov cocktails into an Oregon Right to Life office. On June 27, 2022, 2 Molotov cocktails thrown into Two Hearts Pregnancy Center in Everett, Washington. June 30th of 2022, a Molotov cocktail was thrown into the Hope Clinic for Women in Nashville. Federal law enforcement did investigate the crime as attempted arson and vandalism, but not the FACE Act. Molotov cocktails are thrown repeatedly. Arsons happen repeatedly. The defacing of property, the vandalism of property, the threats against people and property happen repeatedly. Mr. Dice, can you describe what the FACE Act is supposed to protect?
Well, the FACE Act clearly defines what it's supposed to protect by saying that any service relating to the human reproductive system is protected by the FACE Act.
Right, so the intention of Congress at the time was that not only that they would do this for abortion providers, but also crisis pregnancy centers, churches, things like that on both sides of this equation, right? This is kind of what the intent of the law was supposed to be.
Yeah, the FACE Act knows no ideology. It simply seeks to protect reproductive health centers, facilities, as well as, it should be pointed out, houses of worship.
Right, but we're not seeing that right now. We're not seeing that right now with the prosecution of these 100 instances of violence against crisis pregnancy centers and churches.
Yeah, in the past year, we've seen over 100 of those instances, and yet only a single indictment in the Middle District of Florida.
Ms. Camp, you stated in your written and oral testimony that, quote, no one should fear violence at the workplace or when seeking health care. Given these attacks on crisis pregnancy centers and churches, would you agree that they should be entitled to the full protection of the law?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. So I want to make clear I condemn all acts of violence and intimidation.
Well, that's great, and I appreciate that. But are they entitled to the full protection of the law?
Any entity facing actual, real, serious threats of harm should have protection.
Right, so Molotov cocktails, right? Those would be entitled to protection under the law.
Well, throwing a Molotov cocktail at a reproductive health facility would be a FACE violation, yes, but I'm not in a position as representative of a professional organization of abortion providers to speak to what's happening at other kinds of entities. I just don't have that knowledge.
Well, you don't have the knowledge, but you would agree with me that they are entitled to protection, and they are entitled to the zealous protection under the law by the DOJ, by the FBI, in routing out and identifying the people who commit these acts of violence. Would you agree with that?
Well, yes, DOJ should protect all of us from violence, whether we're abortion providers or patients or others.
So in that case, do you find it troubling, like in the case of Ms. Coker here, do you find it troubling that she has not received a fair adjudication of that violence against her facility?
Congressman, as I think I've said before, I'm just not with the DOJ. I believe there are complex
And I'm not asking that. What I'm asking, though, is do you think, I mean, in her case, in her testimony today, there's been extremism lobbed at her, and extremism lobbed at her employees and the property in which she has. Do you think that that's troubling, that she, years later, that she has not received really any help from the DOJ?
So, Congressman, I can give you two answers. One is, I condemn acts of violence regardless of whom they target. And the other is, I can tell you that acts of violence, intimidation, stalking, threats, murders at providers of abortion, targeting providers of abortion care, are terribly addressed. And so I am not in a position, I mean, that I can tell you, but I cannot speak to the various decisions DOJ makes. I would think DOJ could.
Before I yield back, just briefly, I just find it really troubling that you talk about these acts of violence against your facilities, but when she's sitting right next to you, she just testified to this. This isn't an obscure theory in law that we're talking about or a fact pattern. This happened. And so I'm a little bit surprised that you would not encourage the Biden Department of Justice and FBI to prosecute these cases. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's out of time. Ms. Camp, did you want to respond to that?